A billionaire heiress crashed into his old truck. She didn't know he held her father's last secret. The rain came down in sheets, turning the unpaved road into a river of liquid clay. Elara Vance felt the tires of her imported sedan lose their argument with the earth. The engine whined, a high-pitched sound of expensive failure. The car slid sideways, its perfect black finish now caked in brown, and settled into the ditch with a soft, final thud. She gripped the leather-wrapped steering wheel. This was not part of the plan. The plan was a simple, brutal acquisition. Arrive, intimidate, sign, and leave. She was here to close the final parcel of land for the Blackwood development project, a legacy project that would cement her control over Vance Acquisitions. The holdout was a farmer, a man with a few acres of useless woods and a stubborn streak, according to the file. A problem to be managed. Now she was the one being managed. By the mud. She pressed the call button on her console. No signal. Of course. The world out here ran on different rules. Slower rules. Rules she had no patience for. Through the blurred windshield, a pair of headlights cut through the downpour. They belonged to an old truck, a machine that looked like it had been assembled from rust and resolve. It slowed, then stopped. A man got out. He wore a worn canvas jacket and moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long familiarity with physical work. He did not hurry through the rain. He simply walked through it. He stopped by her driver's side window. She lowered it an inch, letting in the smell of wet earth and pine. He looked at the car, then at her. His eyes were a flat, unreadable grey. "You're stuck," he stated. It wasn't a question. Elara's instinct was to take command, to issue orders and expect them to be followed. "I have a meeting," she said, her voice clipped and precise. "I need a tow. I'll pay for your time and any damages." The man's gaze didn't flicker. He just looked at her, his expression giving nothing away. The rain dripped from the brim of his cap. "Land doesn't rush," he said. He turned and walked back to his truck. For a moment, she thought he was leaving. It was the kind of dismissal she was entirely unused to. But then she heard the rattle of a chain. He was hooking her precision-engineered vehicle to his relic. He worked efficiently, his hands sure and calloused. He gave a sharp tug on the chain, testing the connection, and then climbed back into his cab. The sedan was pulled from the mud with a great sucking sound. It was an undignified birth back onto solid ground. He got out and unhooked the chain, coiling it with the same deliberate pace. She got out of her car, the heels of her expensive shoes sinking into the soft shoulder of the road. She reached into her purse for her wallet. "How much?" He ignored the question. "You're here for the Thorn property." Again, not a question, a statement of fact. "I am," she confirmed, her tone hardening. She was back on familiar ground now. Business, transactions. "My name is Elara Vance." She expected a reaction. The Vance name carried weight. It opened doors and ended arguments. The man simply nodded. "I'm Elias Thorn." The air between them changed. The rain seemed to fall a little harder. This was him. The farmer. The obstacle. He looked older than the photo in the file, more weathered, less like a problem that could be solved with a checkbook. He looked from her face to the car, then back again. "Your father, Marcus, he used to say this road had a mind of its own." The name struck her like a physical blow. Marcus Vance. Her father. Dead 5 years. How could this man, this rural nobody, know her father? Her father, a titan of industry who had never, to her knowledge, set foot in a place this unrefined in his entire life. She concealed her shock behind a mask of corporate impassivity. "You knew my father?" Elias Thorne wiped a smear of mud from his hand onto his jeans. He knew this land, he said, made a promise about it. He got into his truck. The engine turned over with a weary groan. "What promise?" she called out, the words swallowed by the engine's rumble. He just looked at her, his grey eyes holding hers for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he put the truck in gear and drove away, leaving her standing in the rain beside her mud-splattered car. The neat lines of her world suddenly blurred. The acquisition had just become a mystery. Back in the sterile quiet of her rented luxury cabin, Elara made a call. The connection was weak, crackling with the distance between her world and this one. "Anya, I need you to find something for me," she said, her voice low. Her assistant on the other end was, as always, unflappably efficient. "Of course, Elara. What's the name?" "Elias Thorne, Thorne, landowner in Blackwood Creek. I want everything. Financials, family, history. Anything that tells me who he really is. There's a connection to my father. I need to know what it is." "Understood. I'll have a preliminary report for you by morning." Elara hung up. She walked to the large picture window that overlooked the woods. The trees stood like silent witnesses. Her father had built an empire on seeing things others missed, on understanding the hidden value in assets. He had taught her that every person had a price, every situation a point of leverage. But Elias Thorne didn't feel like a man with a price. He felt like a man with a reason, and her father, it seemed, was part of it. The file had described him as a simple farmer, a widower, a recluse. It was a two-dimensional sketch of a man who was, she now suspected, anything but simple. The next morning, an encrypted file arrived in her inbox. She opened it, her coffee growing cold beside her. The subject line was just the name, Elias Thorne. The first page was the data she already had. Property deeds, tax records, a single credit card with a low limit. Minimalist. Clean. Then she scrolled to the second page, and her world tilted on its axis. Elias Thorne, former senior partner, Sterling and Finch, one of the city's most prestigious environmental law firms. He had been a litigator, a legend according to the press clippings Anya had attached. He had argued cases before the highest courts, won landmark settlements against industrial giants. His specialty was corporate malfeasance. Then, 10 years ago, he had vanished. He'd resigned from the firm, sold his city residence, and dropped off the grid. The last public record was the purchase of the small farm in Blackwood Creek. The last article written about him called him the ghost of Sterling and Finch. This was the man she had offered to pay for a tow, the man she had assessed as a simple farmer. Her professional pride, a sharp and brittle thing, stung. She had misread the entire situation. This wasn't a negotiation over land value. This was something else entirely. The file contained one more critical detail. The last major case Elias Thorne had worked on before he disappeared. It was a class action suit against Omnichem, a corporation accused of illegally dumping toxic waste, leading to groundwater contamination. Omnichem had been acquired by a holding company 2 years after the lawsuit was settled out of court. A holding company managed by Vance Acquisitions, an acquisition overseen by her father's protégé, Julian Croft. The name left a sour taste in her mouth. Julian was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who saw business as a blood sport. He was the one pushing hardest for the Blackwood project. Elara closed the laptop. The quiet cabin suddenly felt confining. She needed to see him again. Not as a CEO dealing with a landowner, but as a player who had just discovered the board was infinitely more complex than she had imagined. She drove back to the Thorne property. This time, she parked her clean sedan at the edge of the road and walked up the long gravel driveway. The farm was modest but meticulously kept. A neat vegetable garden, fences in good repair, a small, sturdy-looking house with a welcoming porch. It was a picture of a life built on purpose, not profit. She found him near the barn, mending a section of fence. With him was a young girl, no older than 8, sitting on the grass with a sketchbook in her lap. The girl had her father's serious grey eyes, but a softness around her mouth that he lacked. Elias looked up as Elara approached. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He just straightened up, a pair of wire cutters in his hand. The little girl looked at Elara with open curiosity. "This is Lily," Elias said. His voice was different when he said her name, softer. Elara, accustomed to boardrooms and hostile negotiations, found herself at a loss. Children were not in her operational skill set. "Hello, Lily," she said, the words feeling stiff and unfamiliar. Lily didn't reply. She simply tore a page from her sketchbook and held it out. On it was a detailed drawing of a bird with a bright blue back and a sharp beak perched on a branch. A kingfisher. The lines were confident, the detail remarkable for a child. It was a gift, an offering with no agenda, no expected return on investment. It was a transaction of pure goodwill. Elara took the paper, her fingers brushing the child's. "Thank you. It's beautiful." Lily gave a small, solemn nod and went back to her drawing. The simple exchange had completely disarmed Elara. It was a glimpse into a world governed by connection, not contracts. She looked at Elias, who had watched the whole interaction without a word. "You were a lawyer," she said. It was an accusation and a question. "I was," he confirmed. He turned back to the fence, twisting a new piece of wire into place with a sharp, final motion. "Why did you leave?" He tested the wire's tension. Some things cost too much. The Omnichem case. His hands stilled. He looked at her then, and for the first time she saw something behind the stoic mask, a flicker of old, cold pain. That was part of it. "My father," she pressed. "The promise." What was it? Elias looked over at his daughter, who was now engrossed in drawing the clouds. He seemed to be weighing his words, or perhaps the consequences of them. "Your father came here 10 years ago," he began, his voice low. "Right after the Omnichem settlement, he walked this land. With me. With my wife. His wife. Lena. The file had listed her as deceased, an accident. He saw the promise he'd made to the investors who bought Omnichem was built on a lie," Elias continued. "He saw what they were covering up, what the settlement didn't fix. He gave me his word this specific parcel would never be developed, that he would place a conservation easement on it himself. He said it was the only way to be sure the contamination plume from the old site didn't spread." Elara felt a chill despite the mild afternoon sun. Her father had known. He had known the land was compromised and had concealed it, or worse, had been part of concealing it. "But he never filed the easement," she said, the words coming out as a harsh whisper. "No," Elias said, his gaze distant. "He died before he could make it right. And men like Julian Croft have longer memories for profits than for promises." A phone buzzed in Elara's pocket, pulling her from the past and back into the urgent present. It was Julian. His name on the screen felt like an indictment. She ignored the call. Her carefully constructed reality was fracturing. Her father wasn't just a brilliant businessman. He was a man with a secret, a man who had tried to correct a wrong. And Julian Croft wasn't just an ambitious colleague. He was the ghost of that old wrong. She looked at the drawing in her hand. The kingfisher, a bird that dives from a safe height into dangerous water to get what it needs. She knew then that this was no longer about acquiring land. It was about inheriting a fight. Julian's voice was a slick purr of impatience over the phone later that day. "Elara, any progress with our farmer?" "The board is getting anxious. The preliminary site prep teams are ready to move in." Elara stood in her cabin, the drawing of the kingfisher sitting on the mantelpiece. "We need to be careful, Julian. There are complications with the environmental surveys." A short, humorless laugh came down the line. "Complications are just opportunities for creative solutions. I trust you'll handle it. Don't let some local hick derail $1 billion project. We have a schedule to keep." He hung up before she could reply. The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. Handle it. The words echoed with a cold finality. Julian operated on the principle that any obstacle could be removed, one way or another. 2 days later, the first move was made. Elara was driving back from the small-town grocery store when she saw the trucks. 2 large flatbeds belonging to a geological survey company parked at the entrance to Elias Thorne's property. Men in hard hats were unloading equipment. They were driving bright orange stakes into the ground, marking out drilling sites. They were well inside his property line. It was a deliberate provocation, an act of corporate intimidation designed to show power, to demonstrate that boundaries were merely suggestions. She pulled over and saw Elias walking down his driveway. He moved with the same unhurried pace she'd first seen in the rain. He carried no weapon, displayed no overt anger. He simply walked toward the survey crew chief, a large man with a clipboard and an air of belligerent authority. "This is private property," Elias said, his voice calm but carrying clearly over the sound of the truck engines. The crew chief consulted his clipboard with theatrical slowness. "We have a work order from Vance Acquisitions. We're just doing our job. Your work order is for the adjacent parcel. You're trespassing. I need you and your men to leave." The chief smirked. "We'll leave when we're done." He turned his back on Elias, a clear gesture of dismissal. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He walked to the nearest orange stake, gripped it with both hands, and pulled it from the earth with a single, smooth motion. He dropped it on the ground and moved to the next one. He worked methodically, his actions speaking louder than any threat could. He was not destroying their equipment or confronting their men. He was simply undoing their work. He was erasing their presence. It was an act of profound, quiet defiance. The crew chief's face flushed with anger. He took a step toward Elias. "Hey! I told you! That's enough!" Elara's voice cut through the tension. She had gotten out of her car and was walking toward them. The authority in her tone was absolute. It was the voice she used to silence boardrooms. The crew chief turned, surprised. "Ma'am? Pack up your equipment and get off this property. Now. Your work order has been rescinded. But Mr. Croft does not sign my checks," she said, her eyes cold. "I do. Leave." The man hesitated, caught between 2 conflicting sources of power. He looked from Elara's unyielding face to Elias, who stood silently holding a fistful of orange stakes. The chief made his choice. He grumbled something to his men, and they began, reluctantly, to pack their gear. Elara turned to Elias. This was Julian. "He went behind my back." "I know," Elias said. He dropped the stakes onto the pile he had made. They clattered on the gravel. "This is how it starts." His words hung in the air. "This is how it starts." It implied an ending he had seen before. That night, the real attack came. It wasn't physical. It was surgical. It was Julian's true weapon. Elara was reviewing the authentic environmental reports on her laptop when the screen went blank. A message appeared. "Corporate security alert. Your access has been suspended pending a review of network protocol violations." She was locked out. Her phone rang. It was Anya, her voice tight with panic. "Elara, something's wrong. There's been a data leak. An environmental report on Blackwood Creek was sent to the press and the entire board. But it's not the real one. It's been altered. It minimizes the contamination risks and has your digital signature on it. They're saying you're trying to hide something, to push the project through no matter the cost. Julian is calling for an emergency meeting to discuss your immediate suspension. It was a perfect corporate assassination." Julian had not only framed her, but had used her reputation for ruthless efficiency against her. He had painted her as the villain. Then, a second blow. A text message from the management of her apartment building in the city. "Mandatory evacuation. Gas leak detected. All residents must vacate immediately. A gas leak in a state-of-the-art building. It was too convenient. It was a clear message. You are not safe. We can reach you anywhere." She was cut off, framed, and homeless. The intricate support system of her life, her access, her reputation, her home, had been dismantled in a matter of hours. She was exposed, vulnerable. She stood in the silence of the cabin, the digital and physical walls of her world crumbling around her. She had only one option left. One place to go where Julian's reach was weakest. One person who understood the enemy she was facing. She grabbed her laptop bag and her car keys. She didn't pack. There was nothing to pack. She drove through the dark country roads, the headlights of her car cutting a lonely path through the night. The rain had started again, a soft patter on the windshield. She pulled up the gravel driveway to Elias Thorne's house. The lights were on inside. She walked to the front door, feeling the full weight of her defeat. The urban CEO, the master of the game, was now a refugee seeking asylum from a man she had tried to displace. She knocked. The door opened. Elias stood there. He wasn't surprised. He looked at her face, at the desperation she could no longer hide, and seemed to understand everything. He stepped back, holding the door open. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The gesture was enough. "Come in," it said. "You're safe here." The house was warm and quiet. The air smelled of wood smoke and brewing tea. It was a home, not a residence. Lily was asleep on the sofa, a book open on her small chest. Elias gently lifted her and carried her off to her bedroom. Elara stood in the middle of the living room, feeling like an intruder from another world. Her tailored suit and sharp angles seemed out of place against the soft, worn furniture and handmade quilts. On the mantelpiece, among a few framed photos, sat Lily's drawing of the kingfisher. Elias returned and handed her a steaming mug. He gestured to an armchair by the fireplace. "He knows you're here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Julian. He locked me out of everything, my apartment, my network. He's trying to remove me." "I know," Elias said, his voice calm. He sat in the chair opposite her. "This is his pattern. Isolate, discredit, remove." She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes. This was not a new fight for him. It was the continuation of an old war. "Why did you really leave the law?" she asked. "It wasn't just the case, was it?" He stared into the fire for a long time before he spoke. "My wife, Lena. She wasn't just my wife. She was a brilliant field biologist. She was the one who found the original evidence against Omnichem. She had samples, data logs, internal memos someone had leaked to her. She believed the contamination was far worse than anyone knew." He paused, his jaw tight. The official settlement was a slap on the wrist for the company. A fine, a cleanup fund. But Lena knew they were still hiding the worst of it, the real poison. She kept digging even after the case was closed. She was preparing to go to the federal regulators, to blow the whole thing wide open. Elara listened, the pieces clicking into place with sickening certainty. The night she died, Elias continued, his voice now flat and devoid of emotion. She was driving back from a meeting. A source, she'd said. The police report called it a single-car accident. Lost control on a wet road. But the road was dry that night. I checked the weather data myself. And her car. It had been serviced just the day before. Perfect condition. He finally looked at her, his grey eyes burning with a cold, 10-year-old fire. Julian Croft was the executive who managed the Omnichem crisis. He signed off on the internal reports that claimed the site was clean. Lena's work would have exposed him. It would have meant criminal charges. Prison. I could never prove it, Elias said. They were too good. They erased everything. So I took Lily, and I came here, to the one piece of land they couldn't touch. The land Lena loved. The land your father promised to protect. I left their world so I could keep my daughter safe and honor my wife's memory. I chose this. Now Elara understood. The fence posts, the quiet defiance, the refusal to sell. It wasn't about money or stubbornness. It was a memorial. It was a fortress. He's not just after the land, she said. He's after you. He needs to erase the last link to what he did. And now, Elias said, his gaze unwavering, he's after you too. Because you started asking questions. Because you carry your father's name. The quiet house no longer felt like just a refuge. It felt like a war room. The two of them, the lawyer who had walked away and the CEO who had been cast out, were now allies, united by a common enemy and a decade-old crime. He has Lena's original research, Elias said the next morning over a simple breakfast of eggs and toast. Boxes of it. Field notes, soil samples, water tests. Everything she had before she died. But the one thing that could have tied it all directly to an order from the top, that was what she was meeting her source for that night. It was the final piece. And it died with her. Or it didn't, Elara said, her mind already working, piecing together the puzzle. A good lawyer, a good investigator, they always create redundancies. A fail-safe. If she had something that dangerous, she would have made a copy. She would have hidden it. Elias looked skeptical. We searched everything. Her office, our home. The police impounded her effects. It was all gone. Think, Elara urged, her corporate mind now fully engaged in this new, more personal form of crisis management. Think like she would. Not as a wife or a mother, but as a scientist building a case. Where would she put the one piece of evidence that could burn everything down? Not somewhere logical. Somewhere emotional. Somewhere people wouldn't think to look. They spent the day in the attic, a space that smelled of dust and cedar and stored memories. Boxes labeled Lena's research were stacked against one wall. They were neatly organized, a testament to a methodical mind. Elara and Elias worked through them page by page. The evidence of Omnichem's guilt was overwhelming, a mountain of data that painted a horrifying picture of corporate greed. But there was no direct link to Julian, no smoking gun. As dusk settled, casting long shadows through the single attic window, Elias sat back on his heels, defeated. It's not here. Elara looked around the attic, her gaze falling on a smaller set of boxes in the corner, labeled Lena, personal. What about these? Just old books, college things, photographs, Elias said, his voice heavy with resignation. I couldn't bring myself to get rid of them. Elara pulled one of the boxes toward her. She lifted the lid. Inside were worn paperbacks, yearbooks, a pressed flower in a small frame. She ran her fingers over the spines of the books. a collection of classic literature, poetry, and one thick, academic-looking volume. The flora of the Appalachian region. It seemed out of place among the novels. She picked it up. It was heavier than it should have been. She opened the cover. The first dozen pages were normal. Then she noticed the paper stock felt different. She felt a subtle ridge. She ran her nail along the inside edge of the back cover. A faint line. It was a hollowed-out book. Elias watched her, his breath catching. Inside the carefully carved-out cavity was a small, black object, an encrypted USB drive, a failsafe. They took it downstairs, their hands trembling slightly. Elara plugged it into her laptop. A password prompt appeared. What would it be? Elara wondered aloud. Elias stared at the screen. He typed one word. Kingfisher. The drive opened. There was a single audio file inside. The file name was just a date, the date of Lena's death. Elara clicked play. The recording was slightly distorted, the sound of a phone call made from inside a moving car. Lena's voice was clear, professional. I have the final report, Julian. The one from your own internal auditor that you buried. The one that confirms the toxicity levels are 100 times the legal limit. Then Julian Croft's voice. Smooth, cold, and utterly unmistakable. You're making a mistake, Lena. There are other ways to resolve this. Ways that are beneficial for everyone. It's not a negotiation, Julian. It's a crime. I'm meeting my contact at the EPA in an hour. It's over. A pause. Then Julian's voice dropped, losing its corporate polish, becoming something chillingly direct. No, he said. It is. The call ended. The room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. 10 years of suspicion had just solidified into horrifying proof. It was the smoking gun. A direct threat recorded just hours before her death. Elias sat perfectly still, his face pale. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Elara's mind, however, was racing. The grief and shock were there, but beneath them the strategist was already forming a plan. They had the weapon. Now they needed the right battlefield. Leaking it to the press would be messy, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Julian would spin it, deny it, bury it in litigation. He controls the narrative. We can't fight him in the media. We have to fight him in the one place he feels safest. The boardroom, Elias said, understanding immediately. Exactly, Elara confirmed. He's called an emergency meeting to have me removed. He's expecting a corporate battle, one he's already rigged. He won't be expecting this. She picked up her phone. It was a cheap burner phone she'd bought in town that afternoon. She dialed Anya's number. Anya, I need your help, she began. It's time to go on the offensive. The plan was simple in its design and audacious in its execution. Anya, working from the outside, used back-channel access codes Elara had established years ago for just such a contingency to reinstate Elara's network credentials for a narrow 2-hour window. It was just enough time. Elara didn't try to fight Julian's accusations. Instead, she sent a single email to the board of directors. The subject line was, an alternate proposal for the Blackwood Creek project. In the email, she formally withdrew the current development plan. In its place, she proposed the creation of the Lena Thorne Environmental Trust, a non-profit entity funded by Vance Acquisitions, dedicated to the permanent preservation and study of the Blackwood Creek ecosystem. She attached Lena's original unredacted research as supporting documentation. She concluded the email by stating she would present the full details of her proposal at the emergency board meeting Julian had called. It was a declaration of war, disguised as a business proposal. She was changing the terms of the engagement, shifting the battlefield from her own conduct to the very soul of the company. The day of the meeting, Elara flew back to the city. Elias went with her. He didn't speak much on the flight. He just sat by the window, watching the neat squares of farmland give way to the sprawling geometry of the metropolis. He was a man returning to a world he had abandoned to face the ghost that had driven him away. Elara wore a simple, dark grey dress. It was a suit of armor, tailored and severe. As they walked into the towering glass and steel headquarters of Vance Acquisitions, employees stared. They saw their deposed leader walking side by side with a man who looked like he belonged 1,000 miles away. The boardroom was on the top floor, a sterile chamber with a panoramic view of the city. The long, polished table reflected the grim faces of the board members. Julian Croft sat at the head of the table, in the chairman's seat, her father's seat. He looked confident, triumphant. He smiled a predator's smile as Elara entered. "Elara," he began, his voice dripping with false concern. "We're all very worried about you. These allegations, this erratic behavior." Elara walked to her customary seat and placed her tablet on the table. She did not look at him. She looked at the other board members, men and women she had known for years. "There will be time for questions later," she said, her voice steady and clear. "First, I would like to address my proposal." Elias stood silently at the back of the room, near the door. He was not a participant. He was a witness. His presence alone seemed to change the atmospheric pressure in the room. Julian chuckled. "Your proposal? Elara, this meeting is about your removal, not some fantasy about a nature preserve. The board has already seen the evidence of your misconduct. The evidence you fabricated?" Elara countered, her gaze finally locking with his. "Yes, I'm sure it's very compelling. But my proposal is based on different evidence." "The truth." She tapped her tablet. The large screen at the end of the room lit up. It showed a picture of a smiling woman with kind eyes, standing in a sun-dappled forest. Lena Thorne. "This project," Elara began, "was built on a lie that began over 10 years ago with a company called Omnichem, a company that poisoned the land at Blackwood Creek and covered it up. My father discovered the truth. He made a promise to correct it, a promise he was never able to keep." She systematically presented Lena's findings, the charts, the graphs, the undeniable scientific proof of the contamination. The mood in the room shifted from a corporate hearing to something far more serious. Julian's face had become a tight mask of fury. "This is irrelevant, a decade-old matter that was settled long ago. This is a desperate diversion from your own failures." "Was it settled, Julian?" Elara asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Or was it just silenced?" She looked toward the back of the room, a subtle nod to Elias. Then she played the audio file. The sound of Lena's voice, then Julian's, filled the stunned silence of the boardroom, the veiled threats, the cold dismissal. And then, the final, chilling sentence. "No, it is." When the recording ended, no one spoke. The city noise outside the vast windows seemed to have vanished. All that remained was the damning echo of Julian's voice. His face was ashen. The confidence had evaporated, replaced by raw, cornered panic. He looked around the table, but the faces of his colleagues were now cold, hostile masks. The power he had wielded just moments before had crumbled to dust. Elara stood up. "I believe this meeting is over." "Security," she said, speaking toward the intercom. "Please escort Mr. Croft from the building. The authorities will be waiting for him downstairs." 2 uniformed guards entered the room. Julian didn't resist. He was a man hollowed out, his empire of deceit collapsing in on itself. As they led him away, his eyes met Elara's one last time. They held not hatred, but a kind of dawning, terrified disbelief. He had been so sure of his victory. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated the long shadow of the past. The aftermath was swift. The board, in a desperate act of damage control, unanimously approved the formation of the Lena Thorne Environmental Trust. The story broke, not as a corporate scandal, but as a story of redemption. Vance Acquisitions, under the decisive leadership of Elara Vance, was righting an old wrong. The stock dipped, then rallied, stronger than before. Elara stayed in the city for 2 more weeks. She oversaw the legal proceedings, the restructuring of the board, the establishment of the trust's charter. She promoted Anya to chief operating officer, putting the company in capable, trustworthy hands. She sold her sprawling penthouse apartment with its cold glass walls and its view of a world she no longer belonged to. She liquidated assets, untangling herself from the complex web of holdings and obligations that had defined her life. She kept only what she needed. One clear autumn morning, she got into a new car, a sensible SUV with room for muddy boots, and drove away from the city without a backward glance. She didn't call ahead. She just drove. When she arrived at Blackwood Creek, the late afternoon sun was turning the fields to gold. She saw Elias on the front porch. He was repairing the slat of an old wooden swing. Lily sat on the steps, her sketchbook in her lap, coloring in a drawing of a horse. He looked up as her car crunched to a stop on the gravel. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a guest he knew was on her way. Elara got out of the car. She wore simple jeans and a sweater. She felt the tension of the last few weeks, the last few years fall away from her shoulders. She was no longer a CEO, no longer an heiress. She was just a woman standing on a piece of land that felt, for the first time, like solid ground. She walked up to the porch and sat on the top step, a few feet from Lily. She didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. Elias finished his repair. He tested the swing with his hand. It moved silently, securely. He went inside and came back with 2 glasses of water. He handed one to her. As she took it, her fingers brushed against his. It was not an accident. It was a connection. Brief, warm, and real. It was a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had been through and everything that was now possible. It was a promise of a different kind. Lily, who had been watching them with her serious grey eyes, tore a page from her sketchbook. She held it out to Elara. It was a drawing of the farmhouse. In front of it stood 3 figures, a tall man, a woman with dark hair, and a small girl standing between them. They were all holding hands. Elara looked at the drawing, and a genuine smile, slow and unfamiliar, spread across her face. She looked up at Elias, who was watching her, the faintest hint of a smile on his own lips. The sun dipped below the tree line, setting the sky on fire. The air grew cool. A new silence settled over the farm. Not an empty silence, but a peaceful one. The silence of a story that had finally found its proper ending. Some fences mark where land ends. Others mark where a life begins.